In this episode of Roportaj, I am joined by author Ellen James Forehem to talk about his recently released book, The Center of the World, which is published in India by Sanctum Books. The book talks in detail about the Islamic civilization and the Middle East. More from the author. So, Ellen, for the viewers, you write in the book about that the world trade actually began in Gulf. Can you elaborate on these early networks and why this trade route was important for the world economy?
Definitely. Thank you, Danish. Yes, you can, at least as far as the archaeological record is concerned, we know that world trade started between two great civilizations, one in Babylon in Sumer, and the other being the Indus Valley civilization. And we have evidence of that because we have Indus Valley script on these Dilmun seals, they're called, which were the seals that the merchants sent with their produce in exchange between the Indus Valley and the Gulf. So it's significant because it's the first time we have this truly long distance trading activity going on. And we have people actually, and a part of the world that is dependent on long distance trade for its economic well-being. I'm sorry, my daughter came in, so I don't know if you have to redo that. No, it's okay.
No. Please go ahead. We will continue with the same thing. Please. Yeah.
So that's what my first chapter really focuses on. Is Dilmun is really interesting to contrast. One of the really interesting accounts we have is actually cuneiform tablets that have been preserved from Ur, which is close to modern day Basra, but it's an archaeological site, very famous archaeological site. And Aya Nasser was a merchant from Ur, and we actually have detailed records of his travels, of his merchandise going all the way through the Gulf to Magan, which is now Oman. And then also we have evidence of the connection with Indus Valley as well. And we even have his complaining about the taxes and issues with the everyday merchandise issues or merchant issues that you would have still to this day. So it's actually a very rich and long record that goes back, as I argue in my book, 5,000, 4,000 to 5,000 years, where you have the Gulf being dependent primarily for economic activity on long distance trade, as opposed to agricultural production, which causes a very different type of culture and society to develop around the Gulf, because the places where there's agricultural production are more associated with the empires, with the rulers, with the kings, with large armies to protect the land, with the production of those very local goods, which are used, of course, to support the army that then supports the ruler, that then is the classic way of developing a civilization. But the Gulf is a counterweight to that and is very distinct from that type of civilization from the very beginning, because it's an intermediary between different civilization centers. And it's always been that way because the geography has restricted it to that role. And why do I say that? Well, because if you look around the Gulf, it's actually very difficult, the geographical situation with the marshes, the dry mountains of the Zagros, and then the extremely dry deserts that come all the way up to the Gulf on the Arabian side. It's very difficult to establish firm centralized control over all three of those spaces, or even one of those spaces entirely at any one time. So it prevents those agricultural civilizations from controlling it, all those great empires that are the storied empires of world history, the Persians, the Babylonians, and then, of course, even later, the Abbasid Caliphate. And still, though, it is able to take advantage of trade that is propagated between those capital centers of those great civilizations and distant lands. So that's what I think is interesting about the Gulf, is that it's not a story of globalization like in the rest of the world, which is globalization really only happened in the past century or even less, where most of our economic output has turned into services and into trade um, and into the world global economic system. It's actually a much deeper and longer history where most of their economy was dependent on that.
So, very interestingly, with the advent of Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, uh, for my understanding, can you, for my understanding and for the for the viewers, which battle? You have mentioned about the Battle of Siffin, which was 657, and then the Battle of Karbala. So between two battles, which was the most devastating for to divide the House of Islam?
Oh, in terms of the fitness that developed
That,
because of these,
yes.
because yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think what's interesting about Islam and the way it developed in the context of the Gulf is that, in fact, the Prophet talks about this, how you're going to become, more than 70 different sects, and only at the Yom Kippur, at the end of time, will we know who was right. So this was even predicted by the Prophet Muhammad according to Muslim tradition. And I think it's a reflection, though, of the diversity of different religious beliefs. It's also reflective of the diversity of different social and cultural values existing within the Gulf region and the connection that the Gulf had to so many diverse manifestations of culture and society as well. So, for example, if we look at the Ibadis in Oman, who are usually, they would say it's incorrect to call them Kharijis because they reject that notion of being Khawarij. Some other Muslim groups have called them Khawarij, which is quite controversial. But if you look at that case, they are able to maintain their unique doctrine and their unique way of life by taking advantage of those mountains that I was talking about, of being isolated by the geography, but also having ports that allow them to trade into distant lands. So I think what's interesting about the Gulf and about places like Basra as well, which really allowed for the formation of these identities of different forms of Islam, even Sufism, of course, Hassan of Basra, Rabia of Basra. You could argue whether, to what extent Sufism is even a separate form of Islam. I don't think it is. I think it's something that is practiced by many different uh, manifestations of and schools of Islam, of course. But Islam was able to, I wouldn't say that the fitna in itself was necessarily devastating to Islam. I think you could argue it was a fulfillment of the Prophet's prediction. And it has become a way for Islam to spread into many different cultural zones as well. So yes, perhaps, definitely, I mean, there was loss of life, there were these battles, there was Aisha versus Ali, there were all of this drama, but in the end, Islam was still able to triumph in the sense of not just conquest, but in terms of spreading the faith and spreading the language and spreading the Quran to places far distant from Arabia. So all the way, of course, to India and then to Indonesia, and even to China, where there were many Muslim merchants and even Chinese converts who are still around to this day, the Uyghur people. I um, so I wouldn't say necessarily that Karbala or that Siffin, although of course they are definitely important for both the Shia and the Sunni in terms of understanding that historical separation. I think there's also a greater understanding of a shared tradition and a shared scripture that is manifested in Prophet Muhammad's prediction of the 73 sects, but also that even goes further to the shared belief, of course, of the people of the book, the Ahl al-Kitab, which even includes groups like the Mandeans, the Sabaeans, and some would say even Zoroastrians. And then there was an interesting extension to even Hindus later on. So I think this idea that Islam ever was in a complete fitna is, I think, something that can be disputed, if that makes sense.
Alan, on page number 70, you also mentioned this Karamatians who took the black stone, which is at the Kaaba. This is very interesting episode. Who were these Karamatians, and when was this holy black stone put back at its rightful place?
That's a very good question. Who were the Karamatiya? This is something that is disputed and argued between scholars. The latest evidence seems to be that they were actually mostly supported by certain nomadic tribal groups in the eastern reaches of Arabia that felt that their caravan routes had been compromised because of the new focus on Mecca, right? So it's very interesting how they wanted to bring the pilgrimage away from Mecca and to the Gulf instead, because they saw so much commerce, so many people going to, of course, the Hijaz, and they wanted to bring that back to the Gulf where they think it should have resided. And so that's why they went and they took the stone. Also, I think the Karamatiya, they had these prophets who came to them, right? Or these claimed prophets who wanted to promote a completely different way of life. And some would even say it was closer to communism of today, right? So
you're talking about Hatun and Musalamiya.
Yeah, no, Musalamiya is different.
Okay.
No, this. No, these are
Okay.
these are later. These are 9th century, yeah.
Okay.
So 9th and 10th century. So the Karamatiya are after the Musalima.
So this story about the black stone, when was it put back at its rightful place?
It was put back in the 10th century, right? And the caliphs, it was actually negotiated. It was a process of getting it back and everything. And it restored, of course, the role of the wife of the caliph, who had priority as the one organizing the pilgrimage from Basra and from Baghdad to Mecca.
So who was this caliph who actually negotiated this trade?
I would have to look at my book again because I don't recall the exact details at this moment. It could have been... Yeah, go ahead.
You also talk about the Karamatians actually posed a greater threat to the Islamic world. What was the nature and extent of this threat?
Well, what's interesting about the Karamatiya as well is that they had secret networks throughout the Islamic world at the time. If you know the concept of taqiyya, where you hide your actual identity and then have a different identity, there's some scholars who see evidence of the Karamatiya even in Sindh, even in what is now the border between Pakistan and India, and spreading all around within, having began in these nomadic circles, but starting to spread into the merchant intellectual elite that was also developing at the time. So the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brotherhood of Purity, which I talk about, is very interesting because there's some who suggest that they may have picked up on or been influenced, or also the Karamatiya may have been influenced by the Ikhwan al-Safa. So these secret networks are very hard to trace exactly, but you do sometimes see evidence of them popping up. I think what was the challenge was that it challenged the primacy of Mecca itself at the very heart of the religious center of Islam. I don't think that the whole institution of Islam, and especially the Abbasid Caliphate, was as threatened necessarily by the Karmatiya as it was by the Zanj rebellion, the Black Slave Rebellion, that rose up around Basra and almost took the city and almost took Baghdad itself. They built an entire parallel civilization of the Zanj actually enslaving their previous slavers, and so that was an interesting development as well. So there are many of these instances, though, where the primacy of the central government was being challenged, and I think that's something that isn't really fully accounted for in most traditional histories. They present the Abbasid Caliphate as just uniformly powerful, but in fact there were all of these challenges to the power of the Abbasids and the Umayyads before them, of course, even at the supposed height of their power, even at the 9th and the 10th centuries. And that's a reflection of the geographical realities of trying to control this region of the world around the Gulf.
Alan, there is this interesting and intriguing section in your book, The Fall of Sassanid Persia. And how did actually this fall happen in 1633 and 1634 during Caliph Abu Bakr? Also, you mentioned about that pandemic. If I am pronouncing it correctly, it's that Justinian pandemic. How did it actually contributed to the winning of the Muslims and the Persian being on the losing end?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The classic explanation for the triumph of Islam at the Battle of Qadisiyah is, of course, there was a great sandstorm that was brought by God himself, right? And that perhaps that was the case, But I think we have to look as historians at other explanations other than the chance of weather or even divine intervention, because that's not satisfactory for historians. But yes, I think the pandemic probably had something to do with it. And I think when you look at the earliest accounts of pandemics at this time, there's a very clear recognition that the rate of illness and death is much higher in urban centers and places of concentrated population than it is in places where, of course, Islam emerged, which was in the deserts of Arabia. Although they had contact with, of course, through the trading networks there as well, there was less prevalence of the plague in those contexts. So that may be an explanation for why you had less infant mortality, less mortality in general, and even another explanation has to do perhaps with climate change. Maybe that's what the dust storm also seems to represent, is you have these many instances over the centuries of the Arab tribes starving because they don't have enough food, or they don't have enough in the oases, or there's a desiccation, and then they move out, organized into other lands. So I think, yes, the plague has something to do with it. I think the fervor of the Muslim army itself and the promise of the unfall of the spoils that came from the conquest, this dust storm as well, and the fact that the Persians were completely unprepared for an organized Arab force to come against them.
And importantly, on page number 73, just the part of this section, you write about the Persian Navy. They did not build a proper navy. And very importantly, which is sort of an interest to me as a reader and as a journalist and as a researcher, even Caliph Umar, he was against using the ships. Why was it so?
This is a very interesting debate as well. Why did the Caliph Omar okay, let's go back to the Persians there. If you look at the success of the parallel empire to the Persians, it's the Romans, right? And the Romans actually started out as a non-naval empire, right? They were a land-based army. They only learned how to become a naval power when they confronted the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, and actually stole one of their ships and adapted and took that technology for themselves. Unfortunately, the Persians never successfully and fully did the same, right? Despite centuries of conflict with the Arabs, especially the maritime Arabs. And this is a very different concept that doesn't necessarily come into history very much, because most people think Arabs and they think, oh, the Bedouin nomadic Arabs of what is now Saudi Arabia. No, I'm talking about the Arabs of Oman, and the Arabs along the coast of the Persian Gulf, or Arabian Gulf, as I call, who have always been very adept at using, at creating navies, at using ships, at using that naval flexibility to their advantage. And many of the first Arab maritime converts to Islam actually went out on raids and attacked Byzantine and Persian ships. And this got back to Omar, right, who condemned it based on this notion that we needed to focus on the land army and the risk that could come from putting land-based Bedouin armies on ships. So he was more concerned about the threat that a storm could come and destroy your entire army if they were all put on ships, you see? Whereas he thought strategically it was better for them to be on the land. Of course, it turned out that developing a navy is the one key thing you have to do in order to maintain your empire in Asia, right? So the Persians, unfortunately for them, never developed sufficiently that capacity, even after, of course, the Safavids, and then Nader Shah as well. They wanted to create a navy, and they even employed and even sent out for engineers and for Europeans to come and help them build a navy, but they ended up always falling apart at the last minute.
Importantly, the chapter 2 of your book is one of the most interesting chapters, the Basra. Explain it for my viewers how Basra was strategically and civilizational importance of Basra in the expansion of Islam. What was its actually the importance? Because in the book you write Islam actually was made international because of the Basra. Explain it for the viewers, the importance of Basra in the early years of Islam.
Yes, you could say that Islam became a global religion in Basra. It became a religion that could be successfully exported to many different places and cultures outside of the Arabian or Arab-speaking world. And the reason for this is that Basra really became this crossroads and center for the Mawali, that is, the clients who had converted recently to Islam, or even the people who had become enslaved by the Arab conquerors, right? So there were many Persian slaves. There were even, and there were also people who were all the way from India and from what is now Pakistan, and they all came back to Basra because Basra was sort of this forward camp, the Amsar of the Muslim conquest itself. So they came back to Basra with their masters, with the patron, but they brought with them all of their cultural continuity, all of their Persian or Sindhi or Baluchi, or all their different cultural values. And then they wanted to understand what this new religion was that they were converting into, right? Because they didn't know Arabic. They had to learn Arabic, and they had to learn what Arabic culture was, and they had to learn what Islam was as well.
And And you also write that Arabic language was formalized and structuralized in Basra, not in Baghdad or Medina.
No, no, it was Sibawayh, of course. The
Sivay,
great,
Sivaba,
yes, yes,
Sibawayh.
Sibawayh, you say there, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Who wrote Al-Kitab, of course, at the grammar. And that happened in Basra because Basra was the center of the Mawalids who were coming back from the conquest. And also Hassan of Basra, Rabia of Basra as well. You know, Rabia was also a descendant of a slave, Persian. So what's interesting is that they're seeing.
So about Hassan al-Basra, he was actually from Medina, right? Then he traveled to, yeah.
Yes, but I'm talking about Rabia as
Yeah.
an example of another. But the people coming from the outside are able to actually see things differently from those coming from the inside, right? And that allows for a version of Islam that becomes compatible with those on the outside of the Arab world. It internationalizes Islam as a religion. And that happens in Basra because of its really unique place as a crossroads, as having in the markets too, which was a combination of both the canals going out into the Gulf and then, of course, the great caravan routes into the desert as well. It was that intersection that happened there in those markets that allowed for all these ideas to be exchanged and to be tested and then make their way out to the rest of the Islamic world.
So you also write that Basra sort of was an autonomous region. And was it actually politically independent from the Medina power center?
Well, Basra had many rebellions, right? So it was politically independent from Baghdad multiple times because the Mu'alabids, the various, even the Arab tribal elite oftentimes rebelled against the caliph because they didn't like the caliph at the time. I mentioned the Zanj who almost took Basra, who were rebelling. So they were separate, even though sometimes they claimed that they did, of course, have some allegiance to Baghdad because they were the port that allowed the supplies to go up the Tigris to Baghdad. But yes, they had a level of autonomy that I think is unexpected for those who maybe haven't studied the precise history of Basra.
So they also exported. They were so rich and prosperous. Basra city also exported material to the other parts. What does this tell about their economic activity?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, they were a major exporter, and that allowed them, of course, to connect all the way to China. I mentioned in the 9th century you had Basra traders all the way in China, which took almost 2 years to travel that whole distance over several monsoon cycles, right? You had to take to get there. And they even developed a type of Chinese pottery based on their contact with China. So they brought that back and mimicked it. So you know how the Chinese today, they take something that is invented maybe in India or the United States, and they create a Chinese cheap version. This happened in reverse in Basra. They took something from the Chinese, made a cheap version in Basra. So you even see this interesting new ceramic technique and this influence all the way from Chinese culture.
So on a lighter note, can we call today China a neo Basra or a modern Basra?
Oh dear. I'm not going to say. I'm not an expert in modern China, so I will not.
So let me begin by now the 10th century. In the 10th century, you write that the caliph, he had sort of almost lost all the power, basically the religious power. This was the era, this was the time when the ulemas take over.
Yes.
Yes. How did this shift impacted actually the Muslim world? Because he was only now the political head, not the religious head. What impact did this have on the Muslim world?
I think it had in a way, it liberated Islam away from a political straitjacket, in a sense, because no longer was Islam strictly associated with a political power, but rather with the ideas of the followers of, for example, Ibn Hanbal, who was the most famous for causing, one of the reasons for causing this rupture of Islam and the schools of Islam away from the Caliph himself. So Ma'mun ibn Hanbal, many people know the story, but Ibn Hanbal, of course, was imprisoned by Ma'mun because he didn't follow the doctrine that Ma'mun believed he should follow in terms of the createdness of the Quran. It's a very complicated story that has to do with theology, but it really has to do with power in the end, and whether it's the caliph's vision of Islam that will prevail, or whether it's the vision of the ulama represented by Ibn Hanbal. So Ibn Hanbal, however, eventually prevails, and his idea that the interpretation of Islam shouldn't be merely in the hands of whatever caliph is in power, but in the hands of those with superior knowledge. Or there's a passage of the Quran that talks about the idea of those with greater knowledge and understand these things, which supported their argument, allowed for Islam to, as a religion, to really develop away from being solely under the power of a political or dynastic system, or any one dynastic system. So the caliphs were still around, of course, and it wasn't until 1258 that the last of the Abbasid caliphs was killed, and even after then, of course, you have a long tradition of the caliphate continuing even through the Ottomans, but they no longer could, as Ma'mun tried to do, dictate doctrine and theology from a centralized position around most of the Islamic world. It became more a question of ijma, or consensus between different scholars, leading on the basis of their knowledge and training about all of these new hadith that were being written down at the time. That's one of the reasons why Basra is so important too, is where the hadith are written down. Is many of these were written down in Basra, again, for the benefit of those who were converting to Islam or had recently converted to Islam, right? There was an understanding that we needed to go out and make sure that we had the transmitters correctly written down. And we also knew that we also needed to know that certain Arabic words, we need to know their meaning as they were understood by the Prophet Muhammad, because as you know, with language, meaning changes all the time. So that was another reason why Basra was central. But yes, Ibn Hanbal and this conflict with Ma'mun is part of what allowed Islam, in fact, to spread further, because it was no longer simply a political faith. It was a faith that could exist as a system in many different political contexts, even in non-Muslim societies.
So, in your words, it was a positive step that happened to the Muslim world.
I think so. I mean, when you think about, as a historian, we don't usually think in terms of positive, negative. We just think in terms of events, usually in the long run. So that's because there's a tradition in history of, you're supposed to be kind of outside of, you're supposed to not be a tribunal. You're not supposed to say, well, this.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Before we come to this interesting another topic of Hormuz, there is this Siraf and Kish. What about these two cities? How important and what impact they had for the Islamic world?
Oh, they're really fascinating as well, because one of the issues with the Persian Gulf is that it's very shallow along much of the shore, except on the Persian side. So Saraf was basically where the ships with the deeper holes, and the longer distance trade, they had to drop off all of their merchandise in Saraf, and then it was put onto smaller ships that could then make their way, of course, up the Tigris, which was much shallower, and you had a lot more sandbanks and problems with things. So Saraf became basically this huge merchandise exchange center and customs house type, um, very interesting city because it didn't have it very much fresh water at all. In fact, it had to take fresh water from the ships themselves. It had the equivalent of pre-modern skyscrapers. They had built from actually the abandoned ships. They would take the beams and the boards and build, up to 10 stories right up onto the cliffs, because it's a very sheer kind of mountainside going up behind Saraf. And it really represents an early example of sort of a Dubai of the region because it was entirely dependent on these ships coming in with their water, with their merchandise. And it was a city basically populated by merchants and almost entirely and sailors. And it was crucial, of course, for this long distance trade as being that primary port. What's interesting, though, is that both an earthquake and then rivalry with other potential ports, including Kish, which was an island that had a similar kind of harbor that could be used. They actually, the ruler of Kish actually went and tried to capture some of the merchants and force them onto his island, right? Eventually, though, that story probably it wasn't as successful. What's more successful is that the merchants eventually did, as a group, move from Saraf, and it was a gradual motion actually down to the southeast of the Gulf until you finally got to Hormuz. Kish is mentioned in Benjamin of Tudela in the 12th century already, and who was a Jewish traveler all the way from Spain who writes his accounts of many of the Jewish community even in the Persian Gulf. And one thing he says about Kish is that it's entirely unlike any other place that he's seen in his travels, and he came all the way from Spain. It's the only place he's seen that is entirely merchants, right? And it's entirely these people dedicated to exchange across great distances. So even Benjamin Tudela found that really unique and fascinating about Kish. Later on, of course, we have the accounts of Marco Polo as well, who gives us some really rich material about the importance of these different centers of trade and moving down, kind of hopping and skipping until eventually everything ends up on Hormuz Island.
Your third chapter, which is the Siraf chapter, you were just talking about, it ends on a sad note with the downfall of the Abbasids and the fall of Baghdad, where you have also written about the Mongols. If you could quickly summarize few key factors that led to the downfall of the Abbasids, for myself also and for my viewers.
Oh, goodness. Well, that's a huge topic for all the Abbasids. Yes, it's interesting because actually the Abbasids had a bit of a revival in the later centuries. It's called the Silver Age of the Abbasids because they came back. But the rise of the Mongols, it was almost an unstoppable force that was spreading all the way from the steppes to Central Asia. And in fact, it was predicted, of course, in literature at the time. If you look at the literature at the time, the Arabic literature, and also accounts called the Alexander romances, so these stories about Iskander and Alexander, he was actually the one who went up and locked the gates and kept the Mongols, the Gog and Magog, from coming and invading. What that tells you is that story really reflects over time that there have been, from the steppes of Central Asia, many of these waves that have pushed peoples from one section to the next. Because when you had in the center of Central Asia, which is really Mongolia, if you think about it, once they invade into another section, it pushes those people out who must invade into the other section. What happened with the Mongols, though, is that they no longer simply stopped after the first, they expanded all the way out. And they took advantage of and really developed the so-called Silk Road, right? So they put under one government, under one imperial system, the entire Silk Road trading route, which created vast amounts of wealth for them as well. And they simply saw Baghdad as a stepping stone towards further conquest and towards further wealth for their empire. What's fascinating about the Mongols, though, is that unlike the Arabs and the Arab conquests, the Arab conquest came with an idea that was transformed to suit other people. So that's what happened in Basra, remember. The Arabs came, but they didn't keep the religion only to themselves, right? What's different about the Mongol conquest is that the Mongols came with their own religion, of course, as well. Genghis Khan believed in Tengri. They had a vision of the sky god, right? But they didn't create a scripture that was universalized and that could be propagated to other peoples successfully or as quickly as Islam did. So in the end, the Mongols became assimilated by the people that they conquered. So the Mongols became Muslim eventually in the 13th century in Persia, where they were ruling as Ilkhanids, and then, of course, Seljuks take over later. But the Mongols themselves become Muslim in the places that are majority Muslim. They became Buddhist in the places that are majority Buddhist. And even Russian, Orthodox in places where they went into Russia with the Golden Horde. So they're this very interesting example of the largest land empire and one of the most powerful empires in world history, but one that ended up being assimilated by the people that it conquered. So yes, we talk about the fall of Baghdad, which was a devastating event in 1258, and the Tigris River was said to have run black and red with ink from all the books that were destroyed, and then the blood of all the people who were massacred. But I think we have to look beyond simply those particular events and then look at the long-term course of history as well. And what happened is that, yes, the fall of Baghdad did, in fact, divert some of this long-distance trade through the Red Sea. And you had the rise of new power centers in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt, right? Because Egypt was becoming the center of the Mamluks, the Ayyubids, who were successfully fighting back the Crusaders, who were even being considered the new center of the Islamic world. But the trade through the Gulf did not completely collapse either. It was still very much a rival with the Red Sea, and eventually set up the stage for the rise of Hormuz, which we talk about in the next chapter.
Now to the Hormuz and Mr. Alfonso de Albuquerque. He called Hormuz, the jewel in the necklace. Can you expand on this metaphor?
Yes, it was the jewel. I think what's interesting about Albuquerque is his original intention was to actually conquer Mecca too, and to take Aden, Hormuz, and then take Hormuz, then Aden, and then Mecca, even to take the whole navy in and take the battle that he thought he was continuing of the Reconquista, right? Because he came from Portugal, which had only recently, in the last century as well, at that time, was pushed out the Muslims from Portugal, right? And only in 1492 had the last of had Granada been pushed out of Iberia. So he thought that this was a continuation of that Reconquista in a sense. And he was taking it to the center of the Islamic world. The Portuguese navies, however, were defeated in their attempt to take the Bab al-Madhab, but they did take this very strategic choke point in Hormuz. And it was an extraordinary surprise in many respects because he was completely outnumbered and he had these vast array of the navy. He even had one of the princes from India who brought one of his naval ships there to help protect Hormuz. But Albuquerque used the element of surprise and a sudden invasion, and also some would say they had superior artillery, although there's some debate about that too, because of course artillery was also shared uh, by the Portuguese rivals as well. But they were able to blast themselves into Hormuz and then hold the Prince of Hormuz captive and basically turn him into a vassal of the Portuguese king as opposed to Persia. So they took the Persian, they merely transferred him under the crown of Portugal as opposed to the crown of the Persians. And what's interesting is that Albuquerque, he wanted to sort of push Catholicism and he wanted to push this notion of defeating Islam. But his successors sort of abandoned that approach when they realized it wasn't making very much money for them. It wasn't very successful commercially because it prevented merchants from coming to Hormuz. When you had Inquisition, it was very bad for business. And it turned out that the Portuguese soon realized that the customs house was really the wellspring of the money, that was the foundation.
And sorry for this interjection. And you write it was the pursuit of profit or prophecy about the successors of Albuquerque.
It was, which is interesting, even though he himself, of course, had this grand vision of the conquest of Islam and the defeat of Islam. In the end, it was those who wanted to develop more commercial success in the region that moderated this. And even King Manuel himself, who was the king of Portugal and is very famous for the spread of the Portuguese Empire, and he was really, it's like King Manuel was really the one behind most of the success of the Portuguese in financing this. He sent a special message about Hormuz saying we need to allow Hormuz to be religiously tolerant. We can't impose the Inquisition here. We can't take down mosques.
I was coming to that question. They ruled Goa completely in a different manner, the Portuguese, but they applied entirely different political setup when it comes to Hormuz. Why? Was it because of the trade?
I think in particular because of the unique amount, the truly extraordinary amount of wealth that was coming from the customs house itself. Because
and they could not upset the business.
They could not upset the business because it was very easy for those traders to simply potentially go to a different port, even to go to the pirates who are.
But what strikes me here was that Goa was also a port city, and Hormuz too was a port city. So it must be that Hormuz was more important and there was more trade going in Hormuz than in Goa.
No, I understand where you're coming from. But I also think Goa had a different economic system than Hormuz, because Hormuz had very little agricultural production at all. I mean, there was a little bit of date production on the mainland, but Goa had some agriculture, and even the Portuguese lands that were outside of the island of Goa as well. When you have peasants or you have people who are on the land, there's a lot more control that one can have as an empire over those people because they're on that land itself. And so that leads to much more successful conversion happening over generations. When you have merchants coming randomly from other places and only staying for certain months out of the year, and they can't stay other months out of the year or they will lose their profits, you have a very different society entirely. You have something more like an airport. You can if you had an airport today and they tried to convert everybody who went to that airport and you had to be converted in order to go to the airport, people would stop going to the airport. Right? If people would stop flying through Doha if you had to convert to Islam in order to go to Doha, right? Except for the Muslims, maybe it would continue. But um, so that's similar to what happened with Hormuz, you see? Whereas Go was much
So
more,
you also
much more
write in
there.
you also write in the book that Portuguese sort of accepted Hormuz, then turning the other way around.
They did, although you had certain, when the Jesuit priests visited, that's where we get some of our richest material describing Hormuzi society, because they came and they condemned what they saw, because they saw different faiths mixing together. They saw people burying their dead next to one another of different faiths, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Hindu. They saw relations between male and females of different faiths as well. And they saw all this as something against, of course, their strict interpretations of their own faith. Now, that, of course, gives us as a historian really good, rich material for describing what was really going on in Hormuz. And the Portuguese were technically in charge, indeed, and they had control over the fort, which is this massive and incredible piece of architecture. I mean, that's one thing that the Portuguese brought into the Persian Gulf and into the entire east coast of Africa as well, and into India, was this fort architecture that was built upon the Gothic architectural mastery that had developed in Europe and that was being brought over to Asia at the time. People talk about the ships all the time, but it's also the architecture of the cisterns, because they use the same kind of arches and architectonic methods to develop these massive cisterns. Because if you had primacy over the water supply, you had primacy over everything in the end, right? Because you controlled where the fresh water was coming from. So the Portuguese, they had the fort, but they didn't necessarily have the minds and hearts, everybody else. Also, even the Augustinian monastery, even the church itself, even the priests were all individually paid by the customs house revenue, so that money was coming to the organist, was going to the priests, was going to the monks from the customs house. So why would they want to cut off that by declaring that everybody had to either convert to Catholicism or that certain things were... Yeah, there were, I don't want to give an image as too starry-eyed about this, because there were attempts, interestingly, to convert the royal family of the Hormuzis, the prince, right? There was a prince who said that he had converted to Christianity, or claimed to convert to Christianity, and they were going to elevate him to be the new king of Hormuz as well. That plan, they did try to put it into place, but it all fell apart in the end. So history may have turned out somewhat differently, but I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that would have been ultimately accepted by Hormuzi society, because it was still majority Muslim merchants, although there, of course, were Banyan merchants and merchants from other faiths as well.
You have also mentioned on page 1, number 30, about this Turkish admiral. If I am recalling and pronouncing it correctly, Piri Reis. So who was seen as a threat to the Catholic power. What was his role? Yeah, what was his role in maritime contests of that era?
Oh, yeah. Well, he was a very successful admiral, but also as a cartographer, right? And this is one thing that was sort of part of the rivalry between the Ottomans and the Portuguese, is who could really write down where things were and more quickly than the other, right? So Piri Reis is one of our main sources for that's an alternative to the Portuguese, an alternative to the European view of the geography of the early modern Gulf at the time. Now, yes, the Ottomans put up substantial fight against the Portuguese, and there were several battles, naval battles. But in the end, of course, the Portuguese end up besting the Ottomans multiple times. Who ultimately defeats the Portuguese is not the Ottomans, but the Omanis, right? Remember the maritime Arabs we were talking about earlier. And that's fascinating because what you have eventually developing is the Omanis adapting and adopting Portuguese technology for their own use and then creating their own empire from what the Portuguese left behind after the Omanis conquered them, or after the Omanis captured the forts that the Portuguese themselves built.
There is also this Turkish serial on this admiral. Is he the same admiral?
Which one did you say? Which Turkish?
The Turkish, there is some this a series about this admiral Piri Reis. I think it's
Yeah. That sure. There's the Musalsalat, or in Arabic it's
oh,
called series, a TV series about him. I haven't seen that TV series, but I know that there's some very famous Turkish Ottoman TV series. Yes, it's probably about Piri Reis, I would think. Yeah.
at the zenith of its power, the Portuguese had around, I guess you have written 244 ports in the Indian Ocean and other areas. What does this say about the vastness of the Portuguese Empire, and how was its relation with the Muslim world?
Yes, it's extraordinary. This very small country, really, the Kingdom Portugal, is compared to the rest of Europe, very much on the margins as well, being stuck on the Atlantic side. And you go to Portugal today, I've been several times, and you see that although it's been influenced by the maritime culture and in this architecture, you see influences from all around the Portuguese Empire, it's still very insular in its own way as well, especially as you move out of Lisbon or Lisboa. And I think, yeah, it's what the Portuguese are able to do is really leverage their technological, sometimes even slight technological advantages to establish a world empire based predominantly on trade, but also based predominantly on this uh, this ability to use their military, technological, or naval advantage, um, especially their ability to create ships that could go between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. It's very different going through going south uh, and south of South Africa than it is to go through the monsoon route, which is a little bit more gentle on your ships. So by having much sort of these floating fortresses, right, which was a necessity due to the Atlantic navigation, they had an inherent advantage that they then leveraged, and also the advantage that they had in, as I mentioned, with the fort architecture and with the cannon technology. But all of these advantages were then taken up by local actors eventually. So Oman being the most famous example in the Persian Gulf. And they ended up pushing the Portuguese back all the way until until the 1820s, when the Portuguese were really weakened anyways due to internal conflict, and wrote a treaty with Mogadishu, with Mozambique, that actually gave all the advantages, sort of a mercantile advantage, to the Omanis over the Portuguese. But yeah, the question of how the Portuguese were able to do this, I am not myself an expert on the Portuguese Empire, but I did read a great deal about the Portuguese Empire, and in my opinion, it was really this ability to leverage their technological advantage, and especially the arts of navigation, war, and fortress architecture. Yeah.
Alan, I completely understand your point, and we have been recording almost for an hour. It's exactly 57 minutes and some seconds. So let me pose my last question, which I want to understand from you. It's about the Nadir Shah. He finally takes Hormuz, he takes Isfahan and the other cities. And you have also written in the book that he wanted to unify Shia and Sunni, which was a long drawn thing. So why did he actually fail in unifying the two sects?
Oh, this is, I think it's interesting because we also talked about why Ibn Hanbal and this goes back to your initial question. I think it's very interesting. It sort of ties into this interesting conundrum over Islamic history as a whole, right? Which is that the beginning of Islam, you see almost a perfect fusion of the political and the religious in the person of the Prophet Muhammad, right? Because he is the ruler of the state and he is also the head of the religion. But then after the death of the Prophet, you see all of these attempts at recreating that same ideal, but the inability to recreate it because it is such an idealized goal, right? Because it is such an impossible, is elevated to such a height in the faith system of Islam, that makes it actually more or less likely that people will trust those who try to achieve that fusion, right? Because they say, well, no, you're not actually doing what the Prophet did, right? And because it's so hard to ever do what the Prophet did, that creates an inherent rift then between political and religious. And I think what Nader Shah, maybe because of his charisma, if he had been starting a new religion, maybe it would be different. But he was trying to replicate that same spirit of Tawheed or unity that even the Prophet Muhammad had. But he had all of these other political contingencies that were cutting him down and preventing that from happening. And of course, pressure from European empires and other empires that didn't want to see him rise into someone who would become a significant threat. So I think those are the main reasons why Nader Shah, or any really political movement that tried to revive the time of this unification, has been unsuccessful. Now, that's not to say that perhaps on their own, religious and popular leaders from within the Shia and Sunni community could come together and find some path to unity and understanding at a greater level, which I think has happened in the past, and can happen in the future successfully. Because if you think about it, the distinctions themselves are not as important as the main elements of the message. Right? So, yeah. So I think in the end, because religion had been kind of given to society and to culture and had been separated from political power all the way back to Ma'mun, it's then society and culture's duty, if there ever is to be any sort of new understanding,
Unity, understanding,
unity,
yeah.
it has to come from the grassroots. Yeah, it can't come from a political mandate.
Alan,
Does that?
Alan, I think we should end it here because we have been now, talking for the. And let's end this on a very positive note. And we see some good things happening in the Muslim world. Let me hold your book once again for the readers so they buy it, read it, and understand what and the Islamic world and the Gulf is all about. Please subscribe to our channel Roportaj and press the bell icon to remain updated.